Hi, everybody, for this episode of A Guy with a Scarf, night episode. I'm happy to have with me today Paul McGrath from my beloved city of Toronto. I spent a lot of time there. Hi, Paul.
Hi. I'm not sure if you remember, but we've crossed paths before because I think when I was working on the Olympics in
Yep.
Sochi, what is that, 10 plus years ago now?
Yes.
You were working
Absolutely.
with us on that, well,
Yeah,
on the vendor side, and we were,
yeah.
we'd met before on that basis.
Yeah, I definitely cannot forget the Olympics.
Yeah,
Nobody can, I think.
unforgettable experience. I've done a few of them, and it's they're all like a little bit unique in their own way. They all have their own
Yeah,
kind of vibe, and everyone is a little bit different. But God, it's such a great example of so many people coming together across large organizations to work on a single event. It's just such a fun working experience. I've done a few of them now, and I've appreciated
yeah,
one of them.
yeah. I started in 2008 with NBC and then move up north for 2010 with your cousins, if I can say that,
Yeah,
CTV,
yeah,
and then
that's
with
right.
you.
Yeah,
And I remember that after the first Olympic, I wrote something like, "There's nothing like the Olympics." Having worked with, big events, but then when you have, especially in streaming, you have this mass of streams, events, and scheduling and content and data. It's impressive.
yeah.
Okay, we disrupted the.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise my experience at CBC, so I mean, I've had kind of a few different sort of like almost mini careers with the same organization. So I've been at CBC now for 20 years. I started out on the journalism side, on the news
Oh,
side, and started out working as a television producer. But prior to that, and prior to coming to CBC, had done startups around technology and database programming. So as I continued my career at CBC, I kind of got drawn more back into the product end of the equation and definitely the digital end of the equation. So I moved on from producing television into more digital distribution, and then from there kind of got more senior, got promoted, moved into more sort of strategy and
mhm.
distribution strategy questions, which then led into running product teams. So in my previous role, I was in charge of several product teams, product development, agile engineering teams, that was responsible for different elements of the operation, largely publishing within CBC. And just recently, I left that job and came back to went back to the entertainment department, which I'd worked for years ago. And now I'm in charge of strategy and execution within the entertainment area. And one of the big bets that we've made in that area is YouTube. So therefore, I have a large focus on YouTube. It is a little bit like going back to my roots, working on YouTube, to be honest with you, because I started some of the CBC's first ever YouTube channels in
Ah,
2006. So it's been a while, but I've always kind of had a toe in the YouTube space throughout my career. So it's nice to come back to it. And it's nice to look on it, with a bit of a perspective going back almost 20 years now at everything that's changed and everything that's still the same. So it's been nice to go back to it for sure.
but so let tell me. So CBC, by the way, national public broadcaster in Canada. Um, How was the transition from linear? So, and more than the transition, tell me about the digital product ecosystem. I know it's more painful than publishing video on YouTube. Sorry, but I'm an owned and operated guy still, even if I appreciate everything around it. But
Sure,
as I was
absolutely.
on the vendor side, I mean, if it's not owned and operated, I don't have a lot to offer
I mean,
normally.
like the ecosystem is pretty broad. We publish in both news and entertainment divisions, text, audio live streams, podcasting, both on our own sort of audio streaming service as well as externally on sort of
Mhm.
Spotify, Apple, and YouTube.
Yeah.
We publish a lot of video, um, both on our O&O services. So within, say, a text article or as standalone short videos. And then we publish a lot of long form episodic content. So scripted, unscripted content, news content, live streams. And we do all of that in our owned and operated environment, as well as externally on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram.
And your OTT product is CBC Gem, correct?
That's right. So the O&O streaming product is CBC Gem. With that product, we're coming off like the best year we've ever had.
Yeah.
That was partly due to a large focus on audience retention. So there were a number of sets of activities where we really looked at sort of what are the retention rates, particularly the retention rates that we're getting off big events like, say, the Olympics, where there's a massive influx of audience, or even a big news event. And what are the retention rates over time for those audiences? What percentage of that audience do we keep after 1 month, after 3 months, after 6 months? A large focus on that led to some really great streaming results overall, because improving the retention rate, as everyone knows, just improves your overall consumption. So that was a big focus from last year. I would say we have, one of the premier news brands, definitely in Canada, if not the world. And because of that, it happens on a regular basis where we will get large audiences coming in for news events. So we kind of have like a bit of a sort of superpower in that sense. We don't have to do a lot of marketing for audience acquisition because the news events will drive a lot of audience in. But what we have to make sure that we do is that when there are events like that, or events like the Olympics, that when that audience comes in, that we're retaining that audience and we keep them over the next 3 months and 6 months and 9 months and a year. Because over time, if we can do that effectively, we build up a larger audience base as we go along.
And so focusing on the streaming service, do you remember the phases, if you were involved from the start, or the phases of basically what the team was worried about day one, whatever, or year one, year two? Normally you start with video, and then you go to something UX. I don't know what. It would be nice to know your experience in that.
It wasn't
the sequence of worries. The sequence of worries.
Yeah, I wasn't leading those teams directly for some of these phases, for most of them, to be honest with you. But all of this was adjacent to me, and it was part of the same group that was doing a lot of the strategy. So I can speak about some of it. I think the first phase was concerns about cannibalization. That's probably phase one. And that was very early. And that's probably more than 10 years ago at this point. But there was concerns about publishing on digital services cannibalizing a linear audience. And that was probably the first round of that cannibalization conversation, because that more recently has come up, at a lot of conferences, came up at a bunch of conferences that I was at.
Absolutely.
It's a recurring theme. That was probably the first phase. Strategically, should we do this, and will that undercut our business? I think, as we moved through that question and studied that question more and got more comfortable with it, at the same time, like you were getting sort of an acceleration of streaming services appearing in the industry and gaining audience share. But again, this would have been very early days. So Netflix still would have been small at this point. There was, streaming as a percentage of overall consumption still would have been a very small minority behavior. Then that sort of our initial sort of streaming service, which wasn't called CBC Gem at that point, that kind of went along without a lot of attention or investment for a few years. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, we decided that we needed to prioritize our effort in that space. That led to more investment. It also led to us, we were one of the early media companies that were really looking at hybrid models between SVOD and AVOD. So we did immediately out of the gate. That also led to a whole sort of series of new practices that we needed to learn. So for instance, We had to learn things like, how do you run a DTC model?
Absolutely.
How do you do, all of the customer support and customer service? How do you figure out like payments and transactions? How do you figure out like churn reduction and retention activities and marketing outreach? And then that was probably a phase that lasted like, all of that sort of knowledge and skill building around that. I mean, that continues obviously and is a continuous practice ongoing, but that was probably 3 or 4 years. And then from there, about 2 or 3 years ago, we started seeing sort of the next bounce of this, which I think most media companies are going through now, which is seeing that other third-party services were starting to aggregate content together or aggregate SVOD services. And some of those aggregators or aggregate creators, for instance, some of those aggregation services were becoming really popular. And YouTube was one that kind of like went off like a bit of an alarm bell for us when we actually started seeing data and audience data that allowed us to see what is the size of that platform across all devices and how much consumption is there on that platform. And then some of the other analysts in the industry, Evan Shapiro, Doug Shapiro, there were different people making different points. Marion was also involved in a lot of those conversations. We're really making the point that there's also a generational shift here. It's not just that some of these platforms are emerging as big aggregator platforms that are capturing a lot of audience share, but it was also emerging that very much is the behavior for younger audiences, and it's the predominant behavior. That forced us or made us take notice, and that's what compelled us to think about what is our strategy for not just marketing on platforms like YouTube, but also distributing content. And now we're entering sort of the third phase of that piece of it, or maybe the final phase here, which is going beyond distribution and what is our strategy for working directly with creators on these platforms so that we end up being, say, a co-partner or co-producer to work with creators, and we're working with the audiences that they have already established on these platforms.
How do you work with this? I'm super curious about. How do you work with creators?
I wish I could give you an answer. So. I wish I could give you an answer, and I don't think there is a single answer because I don't think we figured it out yet.
Okay.
What I would say is I spent a lot of time talking to some of the leads at Channel 4 last week. I was talking to Matt Risley. I was talking to Joe Harbinson. And I was really curious about this exact question. How exactly did they set up their operations internally to work with creators? How did they go about it from sort of like a contractual and legal point of view? What's the kind of long-term benefits that they're bringing to the table, and what are the creators bringing to the table? So all of these are very active discussions for us. I think what we're looking at and what we're trying to do is to do a few different things. Production and co-production with creators, which also includes development and funding development with creators. So that's thing one. Thing two is looking at licensing catalog content from creators. So one of the companies that I can note here that I found interesting that I saw at the Stream TV show in Denver was there's a company called Creator Television, and what they do is they are licensing content from a large set of creators in order to package that content and spit it back out onto FAST channels. That's an interesting model. They seem to be doing quite well with that model. So we'd like to look at elements of that model and whether that works for us. So co-production, licensing. And then the third element is something I think Disney has done some of this. I think the NFL is doing this now. You're seeing other brands doing something similar.
NBA, I guess.
The NBA. We're opening our content library to creators to allow creators to play with the brand a little bit, to play with our content a little bit more than what we've done in the past, so that we don't end up being the sole producer, but that we allow them access to our content so that they are producing as well. And we're doing that, likely probably without co-production agreements, just letting that happen a bit more organically and let the YouTube kind of content ID mechanisms regulate that type of stuff. So those are the three kind of main areas that we're looking at. Behind that, there's also the question of how do you create shared value in these relationships, and how do you create a business model so that it's not just, a co-production agreement, but it's a long-term relationship where the creator is getting value and that we're getting value at the same time. That's sort of some of the back-end stuff that we're also trying to figure out as part of this.
I think that's something I've read today about creators creating their own app, so going the opposite route. And it's obvious that the biggest creator in the end, even if it seems, it's coming, that circle that is closing, are becoming super famous when they go to traditional media somehow. So it's two different ecosystem that still exist isolated, but I think it's 2025 is the year where things are really getting a bit of overlap. Not major.
I used to say to people years and years ago, like 15 years ago or more, I used to say to them, like, if you want to understand YouTube, one way to think about it is like, it's sort of like Hollywood if Hollywood existed on a totally different planet. Like, there's no overlap. Or years ago, there was no overlap between that sort of like star system that grew up out of YouTube and the star system that grew up out of Hollywood. But I think what you're seeing now is increasingly those two planets are getting closer and closer together. And in a lot of cases, they're actually starting to overlap. I think you're going to see way more of that. And I think you're going to see way more of that because of just how advantageous the production economics are from the creator economy. I think it becomes inevitable that when traditional television producers start realizing that, some creators can garner an audience of 1 million people for an hour at a fraction of the budget that it costs to make a television show, that kind of becomes inevitable, that because of that, you're going to see more conversion. That's my kind of theory and hypothesis on it. We'll see if it nets out to be true. But I think, that is one of the sort of forces that's really driving more and more conversion.
But it also looks like, as an organization, you have I don't know if it's a model or just a culture of trying things, exploring things in a decently serious way to see if it can work or not.
I think as an organization, we believe deeply in some of the tenets of agile software engineering. We believe deeply in a test and learn approach. We believe deeply in the idea of, build, measure, and learn. We believe in scientific method. So, one of the things that's happened in this organization over the last 10 years is a lot of deeply creative people got better at understanding how to write a hypothesis. And they probably hadn't done that since like grade 6 or 7, in school. But we believe in that sort of approach and methodology because, like, if you are going to experiment, it's really important to conduct yourself and do an experiment in a proper way so you get a result that you can actually be confident in and you can learn from. So when we do experiments, like, we are kind of dogmatic about the idea of, yes, you need to write it down. Yes, it needs to have a real hypothesis. Yes, you need to have a clear way to measure it. And you need to know, like, if it's successful or not as an experiment, because that's the only way you learn. And that's where you learn from the ones that don't work and the ones that do work.
Absolutely.
So we do apply as a company, I think, more and more rigor around that. And that is particularly true for the people that came from the product area of the business or people with a product background. They understand that more intuitively than a lot of the creative teams. But what you're seeing is a lot of that sort of approach and methodology is kind of spreading out into those creative teams.
I think it's too easy here because it seems we are a bit in a product mafia duo because I always saw product a bit at the center, but I always was a bit shy of pushing it because I was representing product because it seems disingenuous. But the more I see it as organization work that in some way product can be the one that put everybody else together. But again,
Yeah, I mean,
maybe I'm a bit biased, maybe.
well, it pulls people together. I mean, there is, I think whether it originates from product or elsewhere, there is always that benefit of having that sort of liaison role or that translator role, the diplomat that can kind of pull different groups together. You know, like, well, you talk to a lot of media leaders, and I talk to a lot of people in the space at different companies. I haven't found any company that can very cleanly organize the company into the proper silos so that everything's working without a little bit of sort of blurriness and sort of shared responsibilities. It's next to impossible to do. So, you know, what are the elements then that make that kind of complex matrix organization really successful? One's like clarity of vision and strategy, but two is what you're talking about is the communication, you know, those liaisons, those roles. I don't necessarily think it needs to originate from product, but I think what we know over the last 20 years or so of sort of the disruption in the industry is we have a lot to learn from product. Scientific methodology and being sort of like oriented around testing and learning. That's a very effective means to conduct your business, whether it be a creative business or a product business.
Yeah. So one last question, and as you mentioned, the scientific methodology, very often, and it's about cannibalization. I don't want numbers or anything you cannot share, but can you please tell me and our audience that you have the data to say that when you did the move to YouTube, CBC Gem, for example, grew and was not cannibalized?
Yeah, so let me break it down a little bit because I've talked about this elsewhere, but I think I can kind of unpack it a little bit more and get into a bit more detail. So when we did this study, or when we actually, let me back up a bit. When we made a bet on YouTube, one of the concerns that came up around making a push on YouTube and making a strategic bet on YouTube was that it could cannibalize our streaming audience. So when we heard those concerns, we didn't discount those concerns. We accepted them as those are valid concerns. If you adopt kind of then a scientific method to that, you say, okay, so if that is a valid concern, how would we conduct a test to find out if this actually happens or not? What would the hypothesis be? If you accept the notion of cannibalization, you will have a hypothesis that when you publish content in one place, it's going to take away from the engagement in another place. So one thing will go up and the other thing will go down. So that was roughly the overall hypothesis. What we then did from there is broke it down into a control group and two test groups. The control group was a group of content, and I think it was about 20 different titles that we reserved for the streaming service and did not publish on YouTube. The two test groups were two groups. One was a group of content that we did publish on YouTube and was also published on our streaming service, but the schedule of when it was published on the streaming service and YouTube was different.
Okay.
The second control was another set of titles that were on our streaming service and YouTube and published at the same time. So that's the full kind of complex picture. Test group and two control groups. First control group published at different times. Second control group published at the same time. Overall, what happened? From the date that we published titles on YouTube, the overall engagement on the streaming service, whether it was published at the same time or published at different times, went up, not down. In some cases, some of those titles almost doubled in their engagement on the streaming service after we published on YouTube. So from the time a title hit YouTube, the engagement went up on the streaming service. So that doesn't make sense if you have a cannibalization hypothesis. No. It's counter to what you would expect from that hypothesis. However, if you have a different hypothesis, like YouTube is a big platform, and if you publish content on YouTube and publish a lot of shorts content to go with your long form full episodes, because of the way that shorts algorithm works, and it tends to go out and find audience and be very exploratory, that publishing approach can lead to word of mouth and natural marketing. We think the hypothesis is, we think that that word of mouth converted then into search, which led more audience into the streaming service. Because remember, on these titles, in these different control groups, these weren't all new titles necessarily. Some of them were new titles, so there would be natural word of mouth and marketing. But some of these were titles that were like, I don't know, 2 and 3 years old. There was no marketing cycle that would have propelled more consumption on our streaming service or accounted for it. So what we think likely happened is that naturally, from publishing on YouTube, publishing the shorts, people would see the shorts on their phone. They'd be like, oh, what's this? I want to watch this. They'd Google it, and then they'd get a result for a streaming service and go watch it on our streaming service. So, you know, that makes sense to me as a hypothesis. To prove that out, we need to do more work. So one of the things that I'm like, reasons that I'm excited to, you know, talk on podcasts like this and to talk about this is to say, if you work in a media company or if you work in a streaming service, if you're experimenting around this stuff, please reach out. Let's share some of our results together. So as an industry, we can better understand these dynamics. Because right now I have a data set that goes well beyond sort of anecdotal observation, because we tested this scientifically with 50 different titles. There's other people in the industry that also have their data sets. I would like us to start, you know, collaborating and sharing. So as an industry, maybe we could do a research paper together or something where we look at this and say, well, this is what CBC found. Maybe, I don't know, France Télévision found something different, and maybe Channel 4 found something different. But let's put it together so that we're not just all talking about individual anecdotes, but we kind of have a larger, like, omnibus set of research that we can look at this and then find out exactly, like, what is the best way to develop a strategy based on some of these results.
That's a super answer.
Sorry, it was a very long answer.
No. I was for once, I like doing these things because normally I talk too much, but I love when I learn a lot to listen. A lot of my friends and professional friends will not believe this, but I love listening lately. So because it helps me a lot. I think it's a great answer and a great closing to this interview or podcast. It's good to see that people have a rational way of beyond buzzword, beyond blah, 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 but rational methodology to define the future of whatever we call it. Media, industry, television, I don't know what we call it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, right? And we all can learn from each other here. So, you know, like, I would rather be open and transparent and collaborate. So, you know, if this podcast results in someone hearing this and go, I have something like that, reach out, let's connect, and let's start learning from each other even more.
I will try to highlight this call to action, call to collaboration as much as I can.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Paul. It was really fascinating talking to you.
Awesome. Great talking to you as well.